In this video, I want to continue my topic of happiness, and in particular I want to tell you about one thing that you have complete control over that can have a long-lasting effect on your happiness and contentment levels. Watch this video to learn more. So in this video I want to talk about how we look at the past, because if we look at the past in a certain way, that can actually have a long-lasting effect on our happiness levels. And it's actually a skill. The way we look at the past is actually a skill that we can develop so that we focus on the things that are useful, we focus on the things that make us happier, rather than the things that keep us trapped up in this negative emotion, and that causes a downward spiral and can lead to long-lasting happiness and, in severe cases, depression. So before I get into the meat and potatoes of this video, let me give some foundation about this. Previously, psychologists have argued about whether thoughts drive emotion or emotions drive thought. So as an example, if you're at home at night on your own, do you have the thought of being burgled and that makes you feel worried? Or do you feel worried and then you think about being burgled? Which causes the other? So why is this important and why am I talking about this? Well, it turns out that both is actually true in certain circumstances, but the way we look at the past events that happen to us, it's always the thoughts that drive emotion. In other words, it's the way we look at things that have happened to us that make us either happy, sad, worried, anxious, or whatever. It drives the underlying emotion. I'm sure you've met people that have this unbelievable ability to find a negative in anything that happens to them. You sit and hear what happens to them, you think that's a positive thing, but somehow they find a negative in that. But the opposite is also true. Some people have this amazing ability to find a positive in really, really negative situations. And it turns out if you can develop this skill to do that, then you'll be lastingly happier. In a book called Authentic Happiness, Martin Seligman points out two key things that we need to incorporate into our lives in order to frame things that have happened to us in a positive way and make us feel good about past events, even if they're actually pretty bad things that have happened to us. These two things are called gratitude and forgiveness. So now let me just talk about both of these points and go into a bit more detail about them with some examples. Firstly, let's talk about gratitude. Now, gratitude has been studied extensively and it's been proven beyond doubt that people who are more grateful about things that they have in their life are happier. There's been many scientific studies based on this, and I won't go into the details, but the results are really conclusive at this point. If you think about it, everything that happens to us, even really bad things, can always be framed in a positive light. That old saying, every cloud has a silver lining, is really true. So let me give an example. Let's say you had a really toxic relationship for 2 years. Let's say you were arguing with each other all the time. Maybe your partner cheated on you and you're just broken up. How can you possibly frame that in a good way? Well, you can look back and you can say, well, firstly, I'm glad I'm out of this relationship. I'm glad I'm through it. And you know what? I learned a lot from that relationship. Also, looking back of those 2 years, I learned quite a lot from being with this person, and we had some good times together. Even though predominantly it was a negative experience, I can still be grateful for the times that were good, the experiences that we did have that were decent. I can also focus on the fact that now I'm free and I don't have to be tied down to this person anymore, and I can move on and focus on my next relationship, which is going to be better because I've learned so much from this past toxic one. If you frame things like that, these terrible events that happen to you, in such a way, it's really hard to feel bad about them. In fact, it's the opposite. It makes you feel pretty cool and liberated. You start feeling thankful for the fact that, oh, I'm out of this relationship now. Contrast this to the approach of somebody who just dwells on the fact that they've wasted 2 years on a toxic relationship. I just spent 2 years of my life with this guy and he's just fucked me around, and it's been a terrible 2 years, and those 2 years I could have put into investing into somebody else. And you can go into all sorts of negative views about a toxic relationship. But the point is, it's not really useful. What's useful is to be grateful about the positives and not focus on the negatives. The other point about gratitude is that humans have this incredible ability of taking things for granted and adapting to things. As soon as we get stuff, we just adapt to it. That just becomes the new baseline, that just becomes the new norm. And then we look for more stuff to try and get. You see, the thing is, if you're watching this video right now, it means you have an internet connection. It means you probably have a mobile phone or a computer. It means you're in the top 50% at least of people in terms of wealth in the world. It means you probably have food on the table. It means you probably live in a country where there's at least some level of democracy and you have freedom, you have opportunities, you have education, maybe you have a job. But how often do we actually spend time thinking about these kind of things? You see, we just take them for granted. So what are the things that we can do to try and be more grateful in our lives? Well, there's two things. Firstly, I recommend going to visit somebody who's in a worse situation than you. Could be visiting a country where they don't have the same level of wealth that you have. I did this recently. I visited Tondo in Manila. I gave a lesson there for a while, an hour or so, And it struck me how much I took for granted, really. It really invigorated a sense of gratefulness within me, because these kids were just so happy to be given an education. And when I was young, I was like, everyone gets an education. I didn't realize, okay? So that opened my eyes. So that's one thing you can do. Go and visit people who are less fortunate than yourself. The second thing you can do is you can take a gratefulness and happiness test, and the link is in the description box below. And then every night for 2 weeks, take 5 minutes to write down 5 things that you are grateful for. Just really focus on your life and look at the things that you kind of overlooked, basically. Look at things that you've taken for granted. Let's say your family. Let's say you're grateful that you have a loving family or you have close friends. Just be grateful for things and write it down for 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, take the test again, this happiness test, and see if your happiness has increased. My bet is that it will, because this has been done many times in studies before. The second thing is forgiveness. Okay, so we've all had injustices. We've all had things that we didn't deserve happen to us. And our natural reaction to this is to be bitter about it, to focus on it. And sometimes we might even want to exact revenge on the people that did this to us. There's actually arguments that this is part of our psychology naturally, because it makes sense, you know, when we're running around in tribes, if people did bad things to other people, then they should get some kind of negative consequence for that. But the thing is, in a modern day society, it very rarely leads to a good result. If you try and focus on getting revenge on somebody, you're not really affecting them in any way. You're just kind of entrapping yourself. You're kind of putting yourself in an emotional prison of negativity. The old saying, to forgive someone is to set yourself free, is actually very, very true. So continuing the relationship example from before, so let's say you had 2 years in a toxic relationship, rather than trying to blame that person for everything and talking to your friends about how bad that person was in the relationship, try and actually just forgive that person. Just don't focus on that and move on. And of course, it's much easier for me to say this than to actually do this, right? But I tell you what, there is an actual proven methodology that you can use. And the guy who came up with this was in a very, very misfortunate situation, probably much worse than we would ever have to go through. The psychologist is called Everett Worthington, and the reason he came up with this is because his mother was tortured, raped, and murdered. And he went through a very, very vigorous process to try and forgive the people that did this to his mother. It was a very difficult thing for him to overcome. But the only way he could move on is by having this forgiveness for the people that did this. So he's developed this technique called the REACH methodology, which is a 5-step process to actually forgive people for doing wrongs against you. I'm not going to go into that anymore in this video because that's quite an in-depth topic and I want to make another video about it. But that's the process that you can follow if you want to forgive people. So the question is, does forgiving people actually really work? Does it help bring you positive emotion and get you over bad things that people do to you? Well, this has been studied quite a lot. There's been 8 controlled studies about this, but the most significant study was done by Carl Thoresen. So in this study, he assigned 259 people to a 9-hour forgiveness workshop, and at the end of these 9 hours, everybody in the group that received this therapy, this training, reported less anger, more happiness, more calmness, more contentness, just more positive emotion. It helped them move on from the negative thing that had happened to them. Okay, so in conclusion, let's just sum up this video. Basically, the way we look at the past can have a very lasting effect on our happiness. We have control over how we frame things that have happened to us. We can frame them in a negative way, and that can lead to negative emotion and make us feel bad, or we can frame it in a good way, and that can lead to happiness and contentment. Even bad things, there's always positive things we can take from that. There are 2 main things that you can do to improve the way you look at the past. The first is to be more grateful and make sure you're not taking everything for granted. And the second is to forgive injustices that were against you. To forgive, you can use what's called the REACH methodology, which I'll do a video about later on. So as my final parting point, having read about this stuff in Authentic Happiness, a great book, by the way, I recommend you read, I find myself, when I think about events in the past, I can catch myself in the moment. When I'm thinking about bad things, things that aren't useful for me, when I'm blaming other people or I'm taking things for granted, I now tend to catch myself and divert my thinking. And I think that's the main thing that we need to try and achieve. Beware of these pitfalls of negative thinking and catch them in the moment. I hope you found this video useful, and I've got plenty more videos about happiness coming up. I publish these videos weekly, and if you want to be notified when I put a new video out, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again next week.